calls throughout the year to help our fellow professionals, and there's some common themes and things that reoccur. So what I've done is I've identified some of those things, and I thought our time would be well spent this morning trying to better prepare and avoid some of those common pitfalls that we encounter throughout the year in our jobs. One of the things that we always like to say, and we almost joke about a little bit, as PGA professionals, we are perceived as expert players, expert teachers, but we're also perceived as expert rules people. And we all get a chuckle that we know that at some point in time in all of our careers, perception and reality will intersect. And hopefully that intersection is a smooth one, but very often that intersection, unfortunately, is a head-on collision. And when I get those panicked calls on Saturday or Sunday afternoons from some of our fellow professionals who are in the midst of a rules jam, oftentimes they can be prevented. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to work through some of these things and see if we can prevent and make that intersection between perception and reality a smooth one. So first, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about 5 things today, hopefully. We're going to talk about the importance of marking the golf course, about hard cards and rule sheets, when a scorecard is considered returned, when results are considered final, and then just a few pointers on how to handle rules situations. First of all, when we talk about one of the things that's so often overlooked and neglected is a properly marked golf course. And many of the rules problems that we encounter are because the golf courses weren't properly marked. And just to touch on a couple things here, a properly marked golf course, it helps golfers adhere to the rules. It can speed up play and eliminate questions, such as whether a ball is in or out of bounds. And one of the other things we like to talk about is that courses should be marked at all times and not just in tournaments. So players get accustomed to playing by the rules. One of the stories I always like to share is about one of my fellow professionals who had a guest come into his golf shop, and he said, "Did you just finish your club championship?" And my friend said, "No." "Well, why do you ask?" He said, "Well, we just played your golf course today, and the stakes are all freshly painted, and there's ground under repair marked, and it looks like you must have just played your club championship." And my friend said, I don't understand." He said, this guest said, "At my club, the only time our golf course is marked and staked and painted is the weekend of our club championship. Otherwise, we never see those kinds of things." And it's just instances like that that are so important that we as a group try to avoid. Golf courses, and we always like to say, even golf courses that aren't in perfect condition are presented so much better if they're marked properly. So it's a very, very important thing about what we do. Simple things like correctly marked out of bounds. Another quick, interesting story about this. I got a call not that long ago from a friend in Florida who was running a senior club championship, and on the final day they had a ball in somebody's front yard, and he said, "Hey Dave, we're arguing about when we're out of bounds. What do I do?" I said, "Well, you tell me what you do. Is the ball in or out of bounds?" "I don't know." He said, "No." I said, "Do you have anything on your rule sheet that defines out of bounds?" He said, "Well, no." I said, "Well, in an instance like this, the player gets the advantage of the committee's neglect in marking the golf course. So the next thing we knew, he had somebody hitting a 5-iron from 2 steps off of somebody's barbecue back into play, and there just wasn't anything that could be done about that. But that's exactly the kind of thing we are trying to avoid by correctly marking our golf course. The pictures in front of you, you can see white stakes that you can easily draw a line between fence posts on the perimeter of a golf course. And one of the first things I would suggest that you do, and it's actually kind of a fun exercise, grab a staff member, a notebook, jump in a cart sometime, and drive around the entire perimeter of your golf course and see what you have. Do you have streets? Do you have curbs? Do you have stone walls? Do you have post and rail fences? Do you have chain link fences? And make a note of all the things that define the edge of your golf course. Because the very first pitfall we can avoid is if we can create and properly mark our golf course so we never ever run into an instance where we don't know if a ball is in or out of bounds. You make those notes, you'll see as we, in a little bit, what we'll do with those when we put them on a hard card or a rule sheet. And you've taken a big step into avoiding probably the most common pitfall that people run into. The other thing it does, when your players, when your members see you out there with a can of white paint and a hammer marking stakes, it's fun to get your staff members out of the golf shop and not just hitting the green fee key on behind the counter, but getting them out of the golf shop and involved in enhancing the experience and making playing the game better. So first point is make sure that your players at your facility never have a question as to whether or not that ball is in or out of bounds. Here's an example I just created, but how would you like to be called into a rule situation in a wooded area, and that's what you see, stakes laying on the ground, stakes thrown away and disregarded? Pretty tough to tell that player whether or not his ball's in or out of bounds. So this is exactly the kind of things we are trying to avoid. Same thing with penalty areas. I took this picture a few weeks ago at one of our local golf courses, not trying to pick on anybody, but here was a long concrete ditch, and in this whole 100-yard ditch, there were 4 stakes about 3 feet apart. Now, that's not a correctly marked penalty area. If it weren't for those 4 stakes on one end, you could have a player argue that this was an immovable obstruction and want free relief from this area. But again, the whole presentation of our clubs, and as it relates to being able to correctly handle rule situations, is much, much easier if we would have just spread those stakes out, stake the far side. As you can see, all the stakes are on one side, there are no stakes on the other side, and just correctly marked this penalty area. A lot of things can be avoided by taking a little bit of time in doing that. You look at this next picture, not a complicated thing, crisp yellow and red lines, occasional stakes so that they stand out to people's eye. And that's just a small example of what a correctly marked penalty area might look like. Same thing, ground under repair. Now you don't have to get out on your golf course and everywhere there's a dirt spot, encircle it with white paint and go through a case of paint, but jump in a golf cart every once in a while, drive around, and near greens and in congested areas, if you have some bad areas, put some white paint out there. And one of the other things that goes hand in hand with this, people, is that oftentimes professionals will say, well, marking the golf course is our superintendent's job. It's not my job. Well, maybe. Personally, I think marking a golf course is a joint venture between superintendents and golf professionals. Both people need to be involved. And the reason I think it's so important that all of us are involved is I have yet to see a superintendent standing around a golf shop on Sunday afternoon making a ruling as to whether or not a ball was in or out of bounds. So even though it may be the superintendent's job to paint and stake a golf course, it's something that we as professionals should pay attention to, because like I said, on Saturday and Sunday afternoon, when those rule situations end up in our golf shops, we're usually the ones that have to sort it out. So it's just prudent to make sure you know exactly what you have out there. Talk about penalty areas. Here's an example of a penalty area that's not marked, just for the information for all of you in attendance. When the rules were changed in 2019, if someone didn't mark a penalty area, by definition, under penalty areas, they are red penalty areas by default. So if you don't take the time to paint and mark them, any penalty area is red by default, and the boundaries are where the land naturally breaks into the areas that contain water. But again, we shouldn't come to this. It's just too easy to get out there and properly mark our golf courses. Now that leads us into our second point. We talk about the importance of hard cards, rules, and format sheets. Golf courses are not all the same. Unlike basketball courts or football fields, golf is played around the world, next to oceans, in mountains, in deserts, and in forests. And therefore, the rules of golf have to be written broad enough so that we can play the same game all over the world in these different places. All of our golf courses are a little different. And the rules allow us to write local rules to adjust for the various situations that we encounter at our local clubs. Now, at most places, what you see is local rules on the back of scorecards. That's okay. Most of us on the rules committee have kind of felt like putting local rules on the back of scorecards isn't the best way to do it. Why? Because, for example, here at our club, I buy scorecards once a year to the tune of about $4,000. Now, if I need to change a local rule, eliminate one, or we have a situation that comes up, we're certainly not going to reprint scorecards. So on our scorecards here, there are no local rules. What we do is we have a hard card, a rule sheet for our day-to-day play that we post outside our golf shop near our handicap conversion chart, and you can't believe the number of problems that eliminates. I mean, why should a player that's out here today playing just a $2 Nassau not have the same advantage or the same rights under the rules of golf as the guys playing in your club championship? You hand out a rule sheet for your club championship, but your players daily should be afforded those same privileges. And what we do here at our club is we have a local rule sheet. We've developed a local rule sheet, and then when we have events, all we have to do is fit the formats into the top. We talk about local rules. I'll bet 4 days a week somebody comes up and asks me about sprinkler heads, immovable obstructions that are close to putting greens. Hey, Pro, isn't that a new rule that we get relief from sprinkler heads around putting greens? Well, I think most of us on this call that are seasoned a little bit in the rules of golf recognize that this is a local rule. It's a local rule that has to be added. So if you want to give your players relief from sprinkler heads near putting greens, it has to be added somewhere, either on a rule sheet for an event or a hard card like we use posted outside the golf shop or on the back of your scorecard. Now, as an example, at this club, we don't use this local rule. We may at some point in time go to that, but thus far, our turf conditions around the green are pretty good. As I always say to my players, chip the ball. The reason we don't, one of the other little reasons that we don't use this particular local rule here is I've often felt, rightly or wrongly, that anytime we can keep the players' hands off the golf ball, they probably have a better chance of doing things the right way. So it's just one less opportunity for them to stretch the limits of the rules. But if you want to use this, a local rule like this, you have to have somewhere where that is printed. It's not just a given. Now here's our daily hard card. This is my local rule sheet that I use on a daily basis, and we don't have to. We're certainly not going to go over all of it, but I'd like to talk about just a couple of things on there. Hopefully it's big enough so you can see item number 3, penalty areas. You might remember, or you might not know, that the old lateral water hazard rule that allowed you relief on either side was changed with the 2019 rules, that you do not automatically anymore by default get relief on either side of a red penalty area. But clubs, associations, and committees are welcome to add that back in. So as you can see here on the tail end of item number 3, I add that back in as an additional option for a ball in the red penalty area. Model local rule opposite side relief is in effect. That question comes up not a lot, but again, a player who's been playing the game for quite some time might assume that he can go to either side of a red penalty area, but in fact, that needs to be on a hard card. And when that question, it's an example of a question when it ends up in your golf shop, pretty nice to walk right outside and say, look, yes, we do use that local rule, and it just makes whoever's pointing that out look a little bit better at what they do. The last couple of little things I point out to you, we all have cart paths. Here at this club, item number 4 on our hard card / rule sheet says all artificially surfaced paths are treated as immovable obstructions. We have asphalt paths, concrete paths, crushed granite paths, cobblestone paths, paths that are covered in wood chips, and we say here at this club on this sheet that any path that is artificially surfaced is treated as an immovable obstruction. So it clarifies just what paths people are allowed relief from. And then finally, I point out a little thing that we'll talk about later, but it ends up being a big thing once in a while. One of the very last things on this hard card, number 8, where it says match play events. For match play events only, the results are treated as final when they are reported to the pro shop. Many of us run season-long or month-long match play events where people set up matches by their convenience and they play a match a month or a match every 2 weeks. Just to protect ourselves, we say those results are final when they have been reported to the pro shop. And as we will learn in a little while, that becomes important because it affects how we handle a rule situation that might be brought to our attention after a match is final. So again, hard cards, very important rule sheets. My suggestion would be you take either the sections rule sheet or, as an example, there's a reprint of the USGA's local rule sheet for their 2020 competitions. Take that sheet, take something you've been given at an event and modify it to fit your situations and your clubs, and I promise you that will alleviate many things that might come up. The other thing when we talk about, just as an aside, very often at our courses and clubs, we deal with formats that we've made up, that committees and groups have come up with, things like scrambles. I'll give you a perfect example. If on your rule sheet you said today's format is a scramble, well, many of us may have a different idea about what a scramble is. How far can we move the ball? Does it have to stay in the fairway? Can you move it a club length? Can you move it 6 inches? One of the things I always suggest that professionals be very careful with is on the top of your rule sheets where you talk about the formats, give a good hard look and some real good thought to how you define and explain the formats, because it's very awkward when you come in and some people, you're playing a scramble, let's say, for sake of discussion, and some people are moving at a club length and other people are moving at 6 inches. So if you do use formats that are something other than our standard match or stroke play formats, take the time to very accurately describe what you want the players to do when they're out there playing. Now, this is always a fun one. When a scorecard is considered returned, one of the things that I think all of us who have ever competed any know the importance of a scorecard and the very strict requirements that come along with the scorecard. But one of the things that is never overlooked at the highest level, but is often overlooked at the recreational or the club level, is when a scorecard is returned, considered returned. At the PGA Championship, when you walk into the scoring trailer, and on our notice to competitors, we talk about how a player can make alterations to the scorecard, but once he hands the scorecard in the scoring trailer and leaves the scoring trailer, no further alterations to that card may be made, and that scorecard is considered to be returned. Now, if you carry that a step farther, and again, one of the things that throughout the year I'll get a call or two upon is somebody that had a problem with the scorecard, and one of the things that makes it very difficult to sort out is whether or not that scorecard was actually returned by rule. And I'm not suggesting this for all of your daily events, but for club championships, invitationals, events that you at your clubs consider of some fair significance, that on your notice to competitors, on your rule sheets, you talk about when a scorecard is returned. I'll give you an example. When we run our club championship or invitational, I set up a scoring area in the golf shop, and on our notice, we talk about, you like we do at the PGA Championship, as long as you're in the golf shop, you can change that scorecard. But when you hand us that scorecard and walk out of the golf shop, you are not getting the scorecard back. It is now considered returned. And if you've made a mistake on there, whether for better or for worse, we will handle that accordingly. A simple thing for those individuals that don't have a large staff where you have the ability to set up a scoring table and do those kinds of things. Here is a simple way to handle that. When a scorecard is considered returned, you can put down there, players can make alterations to the scorecard as long as they want, but once they drop that scorecard in that box that has that label on there, official scorecards, they don't get it back. That scorecard is considered returned. So consider that, ladies and gentlemen, when you're running events and conducting competitions at your club. Spell out when that scorecard is considered returned, and it may prevent a fair amount of trouble later on. Small thing until it isn't. How many times the guy looks at his score up on the scoreboard and says, "Pro, I didn't shoot 74, I shot 73. And you go back and he said, "No, on the fourth hole, they've got me for a 4, but I had a 3. Well, we've got 2 signatures on that card. Well, is the scorecard considered returned or not? It's a lot easier when you spell that out and you have something to fall back on. Another thing that kind of goes hand in hand, we talk about when the results of a competition are final. The USGA and the PGA spell that out in very specific terms. And again, these things become important because I think many times, and I've gotten many calls over the years about something that has come to light later. And it's important, again, for events that are of some consequence to the club to spell out when the results of the competition are final. we pointed out a little bit earlier, when a match is considered, the results of a match are considered final at my club is when those results are reported to the golf shop. In match play, a couple of examples, and these are taken right out of the USGA's committee procedures, and in the back of what used to be kind of the decisions book, but now is called the official guide to the rules of golf, you will see things like this, and I just reprinted these right out of that guide, and two very simple ways when the results of a match play competition is considered final, when the result is recorded on the official scoreboard or reported to a person identified by the committee. I'm the committee at this club, and I have said when they're reported in the pro shop. Now, why is this important? Let's just say, as a simple example, you've got a couple of guys, they play a match, and as the player is putting his clubs in the trunk of his car after the match is over, he says, gosh, I've got 15 clubs in my bag, and he runs back down into the pro shop and says, Pro, I didn't realize I'd been playing with 15 clubs the whole day. Well, the fact that he didn't realize it and now the match is final makes that irrelevant. Just a simple example of the potential importance of when a match is considered final. Stroke play, same thing. When the trophy has been awarded, well, that same player in a stroke play competition, we hand out the trophies, he's putting the clubs in the trunk, he comes back down and says, man, I didn't realize I'd been playing with 15 clubs all day. When did you figure that out? I didn't figure it out till I was putting the clubs in my trunk. Okay, that's fine. That competition is final. As an aside, where either one of these situations would have been a problem is if the player knew before the competition was final that he was in breach of one of those rules. So again, I would say in major events at your club, make sure you spell out and take the words right out of the USGA's guide for match or stroke play when the competition is considered final. It just saves, again, one of the common pitfalls, but when somebody calls you up on the phone, it's very easy to handle these situations because it directs you right back to Rule 20, which handles disputes and rulings if you have spelled out when the competition is final. Now, one of the number one pitfalls and drawbacks that I see at the club level, again, those phone calls that come in, it's such a simple thing, but it is so often neglected, is spelling out tie-breaking procedures. How would you like to finish it? A two-day event, end in a tie. You've got 100 players standing around the scoreboard, and you've got a tie, and somebody says, how do we break ties, Pro? Well, how should we break ties? One guy wants to have a scorecard playoff, one guy wants to go out on the golf course, one guy wants to have a chip off, somebody wants to have a putt off. If you don't remember anything else from this short webinar this morning, the one thing I would like everybody to take away before any competition, any competition at all at your facilities, always, absolutely always post in plain view how ties will be broken. There's never a shot here, never a shot hit here at this club without tie-breaking procedures being posted. And because certainly when you end up with ties, the way you decide to break them can be advantageous to one or the other, but that is probably undoubtedly the biggest thing that people overlook until it's too late. Now, what I've done here, I've just printed out a tie-breaking procedure that we use here for one of our member events. It's a reasonably significant event. But if you look here, it says ties for first place only for the net or gross champions will be broken with a playoff beginning on hole 1. So we're not going to, so we're only going to play off ties for first place. We talk about how the format will be the same as day 2. This particular event happened to be an event where we played alternate shot the first day and 4-ball, better ball of partners the second day. And we even go forward to spell out that the net playoff will be conducted first and take precedence. How often do we run into a situation where we have somebody that's tied for first gross and first net? We spell that out here, that net takes precedence, and we'll break that tie first. And then we go into, because this was a particular event where we weren't splitting up gift certificates or money, we go on to say that all other ties will be broken by comparing day 2 scores, back 9 scores day 2, last 6 day 2, and so on until the tie is broken so we can hand out the prizes. But like I said, when we finish this event, and it's almost impossible, ladies and gentlemen, to run an event without having ties, spend a fair amount of time deciding how you're going to break ties. And again, that one little caveat in here about saying that the net will take precedence over the gross, that's, again, often overlooked. But I think many of us have been in situations where we end up with somebody that's tied for both first gross and both first net. And hopefully you're in a pretty good position to be able to manage that. And like I said, when this was posted up on the board, we just go right there and say, here's exactly what we are doing. This next slide that I'll show you, again, another tie-breaking example. In the club championship, we play here at this club, we play stroke play into match play, into a championship flight of 8 players, with the defending champion being seeded 1. And very often we have ties for the final position, or we have players shooting the same score for, let's say, the 3rd and 4th seed. And again, there's no guesswork to the seeding procedure. A perfect example, in playing stroke play into match play is a common thing we do at clubs. And again, this is taken right out of the USGA manual, but very often people don't take the time to spell this out. But if you look, we go all the way down. We talk about a playoff if anybody ties for the 8th spot, but contestants shooting the same score will be seeded into the first score returned, will be the lower seed. That's somebody with an earlier tee time, just happens to get the lower seed. And it goes all the way down to spelling out, should players in the same group return the same score, the players whose name appears first on the pairing sheet shall be considered the first score in. So there is absolutely no ambiguity about how we are breaking ties in this club championship. And it saves, again, not to try to just reiterate it over and over again, but I promise you this saves a whole lot of trouble on the back end. You've run a beautiful club championship, and now you've got a whole bunch of ties to see who gets into the flights or who gets to play in the match play, and somebody thinks you're just making stuff up. No, all this stuff is posted before any shot is ever hit in the first round of stroke play qualifying. Again, we call this preventative officiating. Now, the final thing I'd like to talk about today is what does happen when we do end up with a rule situation in the golf shop. What do you do? Just a couple of hints on what we do. The first And probably the most important thing you need to ask right away is, what is the form of play? What are they playing? Guy comes into the golf shop and says, "Hey, pro, we need a ruling." I say, "Great." I said, "What form are you playing? What form of play? How are you playing?" He goes, "I don't know. What do you mean?" I said, "How are you keeping score?" "Well, we're adding up shots." I said, "I know that, but we're playing a $2 Nassau, 2-2-2. I said, "Okay, I got that. How? What happens when I make a 5 on the first hole and you make an 8? Am I 1 up or am I 3 ahead of you?" He says, "You're 1 up." I said, "All right, we're playing." Now we've determined they're playing match play. Well, you say, why is that important? Well, the questions that come in, and again, probably the most common one is somebody will come in and say, "Hey, pro, Joe hit the wrong ball. That's a 2-shot penalty, isn't it?" I said, "Well, it depends." Well, he goes, "It's always been a 2-shot penalty." Well, it depends. If you happen to be playing match play, I think we all know that's a loss of hole penalty. So one of the most important things you can do right away, not on the back end, but on the front end, is make sure you understand how they're keeping score. Because I know, at least at this club, probably 90% of what they play here is match play. Very seldom are they saying, my 73 beat your 76. No, I won 3-2, or things like that. So especially at the local level, almost never are they playing stroke play. So that's something you want to determine right away in the conversation. What form of play are you using? The second thing that you need to ask, what part of the course did this incident occur on? And now that we have moved through marking the golf course, at least we know whether we are on or off the golf course. So we want to determine what part of the course did this happen on. Was it in a penalty area? Was it in a bunker? Was it on the putting green? Was it in the general area? Well, why is that important? Well, again, quick example, with the new changes to the rules in 2019, if a player accidentally moves his ball, as a simple example, a player accidentally moves his ball. If he accidentally moved his ball on the putting green, there's no penalty. The ball is moved back. But if he was in the general area, say he was in the fairway and he accidentally moved his ball, Rule 9.4 tells us that ball must be replaced and the player incurs a 1-stroke penalty. So determining and finding out what part of the course did this happen on, what form of play, what part of the course. Third, listen, gather all the relevant information. And just like criminal cases that we hear about on television, very often there are 2 sides to the story. So it's very helpful if you can get both or all concerned parties at least to agree on the facts. What you're trying to do is get the facts about what happened. And if you can, once you can get at least, both players or whoever is involved to agree on the facts, you've got a far better chance to make the correct ruling. So listen, ask questions, gather all the relevant information, and try to get the players, at least once they agree on the facts, you've got a real good chance to make a correct ruling. The other thing that we like to do, and I still do it, and I suggest that all of you do it, use the book. Show them the answer if you can. It's very, very disconcerting when somebody says, "I think this is what you do." That tells these players right there that you're not sure and you've cast doubt. We get a ball moved, as again the example I used a touch earlier, ball accidentally moved in the fairway. Let's go to Rule 9 and let's see what Rule 9 has to say about a ball moved in the fairway. and you open the book and you get to Rule 9 and you get to 9.4 and it says the player incurs a penalty stroke. So when you show them, it's taking you off the hook. It's just reinforcing the fact that you arrived at the correct answer, and you look better because of it. You know, a couple other little things that I would say. We've all made wrong rulings. I've made them. Some of the very best rules people in the heat of the moment have made mistakes. It's like flying a plane. They say it's 95% sheer boredom and 5% sheer panic when you end up in a rule situation. If you don't know, don't guess. There's a lot of resources out there. Like I said, people use me, people use the USGA, people use our section, they use the Southern California Golf Association. Don't be afraid. It's certainly not a sign of weakness to say, you know what, I got to check on that. There have been many, many times where things ended up in front of me, and I said, you know what a great question that is. Let me do a little digging and get back to you. There's absolutely nothing in the world wrong with that. And the last little thing I'd like to talk about as it relates to learning the rules and being a better rules person at your club before we open it up for some questions is we've talked about the importance of and the perception of all of us as PGA professionals in being experts at the rules. And my suggestion is we take a little bit of time and we try to get better on an ongoing basis. Things like this hour we're spending together now. But one of the things we've determined long ago to be a better rules person, one of the things that almost never works is picking up the rule book and trying to read it like a novel from cover to cover. That very seldom works. It's dry. It's like a textbook, and that's a difficult way to learn the rules. My suggestion, which will get you, and I'm making this number up, 30 or 40% better at handling rule situations, if at the end of the book you read and you really, really learned the last 20 or 22 pages of the current rule book that deals with what we call the definitions. What is a loose impediment? What is a movable obstruction? What isn't an immovable obstruction? Take the time to become well-versed and dive in with both feet and get really, really good at the definitions. Out of the margins, the edges of out of bounds extend both up and down. Things like that. Read them. You know, it's a 15 or a 20-minute read once a month. Sit in your office, close the door, and read abnormal ground conditions through wrong ball. And you do it and do it. Once you do that a handful of times and you become very familiar with the definitions, you are so far down the road on being a better rules official, you just won't believe it. But if you don't know the definitions, you're behind the eight ball, because the definitions are littered throughout the text of the rules. And if you don't know the exact meaning of the words, it's almost impossible to properly navigate in the rule book. So in being better at the rules is really take the time and commit those definitions to heart. So that's what I have, which leaves us with 5 or 10 minutes for some questions. So, John, if you have any questions from any of our participants, we're happy to answer them now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Podas. Yes, several questions that have come in. In determining when a scorecard is considered returned, what if in a stroke play competition the card is returned to the scoring table but not signed, and then a situation comes up after the fact? Is that scorecard considered returned even though it's not signed?
Well, if a card is handed in and not signed, that's a disqualification penalty. We learn that, right away. I mean, that's one of the requirements of a scorecard is that it is signed when it's handed in. So if a scorecard is not signed and handed in, if it's handed in by as we've talked about, if we've determined the scorecard, how it's returned, if it is returned and it is not signed, that's a disqualification penalty. If we look at under Rule 3, when we talk about the player's responsibility, certifying the whole scores, make sure the marker certifies the whole scores, and if any of these requirements are breached, the player is disqualified. So that's a perfect example of just exactly what I was alluding to. If we don't know if that scorecard is returned, the player might say, give me the scorecard back so I can sign it. Hopefully that maybe helps clear that up a little bit, but there are very specific requirements about the player's responsibility as it relates to the scorecard. Hopefully that helps, John.
You personally, Dave, what is the most challenging, uncomfortable, difficult rules decision you had to make in your 25-plus year career?
I'll tell you a quick story. It's a fun one, but I had moved my family across the country. I had been at the club less than 6 months, and in our invitational, I had to make a big ruling as it related to a player borrowing a club from a partner to hole out a short putt. And it was during a playoff, and everybody looked at me. I'm shortening the story for purposes. And unfortunately, I had to penalize the player, and I had only been here at this club for just a matter of months. And I was getting screamed at and undressed up and down. And, I knew how to handle it and what the right thing to do by the rule was. And as I was getting, like I said, screamed at, and finally, it went away and I ended the competition correctly. And the individual came back in my office that evening, started screaming at me again about how we don't play like that around here, and that was chicken and so on and so forth, and you're the new pro here, and that's not the way we play. And finally, I felt like it was almost a job-ending kind of a rule situation, and I thought, God, here my knowledge of the rules is going to get me fired 6 months into my dream job. And finally, I took the offensive, and I said, you know what? I said, you're right. Maybe that is, kind of, chicken feed. And I want to run these tournaments here at this club any way all of you want me to run them. I said, but you got to give me a fighting chance. And this fellow said, what do you mean? I said, I don't care if we use the 14 club rule. I said, we can throw out the out of bounds rule. We can throw out the 14 club rule. We can throw out any rules you want. But I said, you got to give me a fighting chance. And I said, you got to tell me before we start the tournament what rules we're not going to use, because I'm not smart enough to figure out what rules you guys do or don't use. I said, so if you would, please, in the future, I said, you tell me what rules we're not applying for this event, and I won't apply them. But I said, you can't tell me on the putting green of a second playoff hole in front of 100 people that we're not using the 14 club rule. I said, how in the world am I smart enough to figure that out? And the guy was quiet for a second, and he said, you know what, Pro? He said, you're right. I'm sorry. He said, you're exactly right. And I gained an awful lot of credibility on that instance, and everybody knew I was only calling balls and strikes. I wasn't doing anything but interpreting the rules, and I had more people come up to me and say, not only do we not play like that, that is exactly how we play here, and playing by the rules is one of the integral parts of sportsmanship. But that was probably the condensed version of one of the most uncomfortable situations I've ever had at a club dealing with the rules.
Now that the result of that outcome, you were correct. Can you talk about an instance, either you personally or what you witnessed in a supervisory category or supervisory role? What was the biggest incorrectly handled rule in your career that you've seen?
Sure. Years ago, and you know, what's considered big or what isn't considered big. One of my staff members several years ago, doesn't matter whether it was at this club or another one, made a fairly big ruling in a club championship without looking at the book, without inquiring, and he was, the staff member was a member of our professional committee, and when somebody makes a wrong ruling, that ruling stands. You know, the player was able to hit a ball that was out of bounds, that he wasn't able to play. And I had to stand by him and say, this is the ruling he made, and though it wasn't correct, we moved forward. And that we live and die with the right ones and the wrong ones. And again, we've all made wrong ones. You know, some are bigger than others, but I backed my assistant up and said, you know what, he's an official member of this committee and made that ruling, and that ruling stands. There are some times you can back out, but when you talk about, you know, allowing a player to hit a ball from a spot and he goes ahead, and once he hits from there, we're moving on. So that's, again, fortunately, we're talking about golf here, and we're not talking about heart surgery. So we can't take ourselves too seriously, although we do try our very, very best to get it right all the time. Occasionally we misfire.
Well, those are all the questions we have for this morning's Catalyst. On behalf of the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to Mr. Dave Podas for taking the time to formulate a presentation and to be on the program this morning. Like we said earlier, Dave is considered one of the foremost authorities on rules and rules interpretation, and we are grateful for him taking the time to educate the section. For everybody on the Catalyst webinar this morning, as usual, we will be sending out the link for the YouTube recording of this morning's Catalyst, along with a link to the Catalyst quiz. Please take the quiz and submit it at the end of the quiz. There'll be a function to submit the quiz. Please take it and submit it. If you score a 70% or higher on the quiz, you will earn 1 MSR for attending the Catalyst this morning. Just want to remind everybody that the next installment of the Catalyst webinar series is going to be on March 26th. Greg Twiggs is going to be here, insurance agent, who's going to be talking about the insurance industry as it pertains to the golf industry. So we encourage everybody to be joining us for that call as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Mr. Podas, thank you very much for being with us. Take care, everybody. Happy golfing.
Thank you, John. How'd that go? John? John, are you still there? I think it went out. How'd it come?
It sounded